Let's talk about reflections. Pretty much any shiny object in the real world is going to have reflections. Anything that reflects light also reflects the color of the light, and that color pretty much is a reflection. Now, some things will reflect better than others. A stainless steel ball or a glass mirror is going to reflect a lot better than maybe dull aluminum or something like that, but everything really does pretty much have reflections. Creating reflections in Max is a fairly straightforward process. There's a couple of different ways. So let's go ahead and explore some of the methods for creating reflections in Max. I'm going to go ahead and open a file. On my desktop, exercise files, materials, reflections. Now in this file we have a very simple file. I'm going to go ahead. It's just a light, a camera, a sphere on top of a cube. But this should illustrate a lot of the things that we need to do. I'm going to go ahead and render it. It's kind of like this copper-colored ball on top of kind of like a granite sort of cube. Now, we really want this to look a lot more metallic. So in order to get it more metallic, we need to create some reflections. Well, how do we do that? Well, there is a reflections map in almost all the Max materials. So let's go ahead and look at the material. Right here is the material we're using for the sphere. And if you notice, it's pretty much just a copper-colored sphere with a multi-layer shader on it. And in order to create the reflection, we have to add a map. Now, what type of map do we add? Well, if we want, we could do it with a procedural map, but that really doesn't give you the sort of naturalness that real reflections give, because reflections really are just reflecting an entire world, so they're never regular sort of patterns. So, for example, if I put something that's not even slightly regular, like the swirl in there, here, let's take a look at this here. Click on that. It's not really reflecting what we expect. It's not really making it look shiny. It's not reflecting the world, so to speak. What we really have to do is get an image of the world or something similar to that if we want to map a reflection. So the first thing I want to do is just go ahead and go back into that swirl, and we're going to replace that. So I'm going to click there and replace it with a bitmap. And on your desktop, under Exercise Files, Materials, we have a file called backyard.jpg. And that pretty much is just a backyard. And it's mostly the trees and the sky around my backyard. So I just took this picture. What I did was I kind of took a panorama and then just stitched it all together in Photoshop. So I'm going to go ahead and close that. Now if we open this up, you can see now this looks a little bit more realistic because it is actually reflecting more of what the world is. So we can have spherical environment or cylindrical environment. We can map it to the screen. I think spherical is probably the best. But we're also getting this kind of gloopiness here. We can change that by changing the angle here. And maybe changing this angle a little bit here. So we can play with it a little bit. See what works. Now, let's go ahead and render that. Yeah, see, now that does look a lot more realistic. It looks like it's actually reflecting the world. But it's still not really reflecting the world, like this granite thing would normally reflect in there, and if we had a sky, it would obviously be reflecting. Let's go ahead and try something even a little bit different here. So I'm going to go over here to my reflection map, and instead of making it just the bitmap, what I'm going to do is I'm going to do what's called an environment reflection. So what I need to do, first thing I need to do, is change the environment. So how do we do that? Well, I'm going to close my material editor for a second. When you render something, it actually has what's called an environment. This is under the rendering tab. We have this thing called environment. So remember how we rendered against black? This is the color we're rendering against. So if I change it to, for example, change it to white, it'll render the environment as white. I can also put in a bitmap. So let's go ahead and put in a bitmap. Let's put in that backyard bitmap. I'm going to go ahead and render this. And now my backyard shows up as the background for the image. Now if I want to, in fact, I'm going to open my materials editor. I can actually edit how that map is mapped to the environment. So I'm going to open my material editor, go back into this environment tab under rendering, and I'm going to click and drag this into an empty slot in the material editor. Make sure it's an instance. And now I can map to the screen, I can map to a spherical environment, cylindrical environment. And what that does is it just takes that map and it puts it in a cylinder around what you're rendering. Now I have to get this map into this reflection. So let's select our material, go back up here, find our reflection map, click on the map, and instead of a bitmap, we're going to do what's called a reflect-refract map. And what we're going to do is we're going to use our environment. And now when I render, it actually renders my environment. And it actually calculates what's in the environment. So for example, I've got this here is that there. So it's actually reflecting what's in the environment. So this is a much more realistic reflection. Plus I've got some nice stuff in here from the backyard, and it's getting a much, much, much better reflection. So that's one way of creating reflections is through reflect-refract maps. Now there's a couple other things you can do. You can do blurring. You can also do atmosphere ranges so that if you don't want to reflect everything, you can say, okay, only things within a certain distance, that sort of thing. If you have a lot of animation going on, you can actually animate that. Or if you want, you can also do specific files for what's called a cubic map. Now there's another way of doing reflections as well. So let's go ahead and put some reflections on this cube. So I'm going to go here. So this cube here, let's go ahead and render this one more time. This cube here is made of granite, and granite's a pretty shiny material. And again, it's not as shiny as, say, copper or a metallic surface, but it still has a bit of reflectivity to it. So we can do another type of reflection if we want. Let's create another type of reflection for this, and we'll use a different method. So in the reflection map here, instead of doing reflect-refract, I'm going to do what's called a ray trace. And what this does is it actually ray traces, it actually calculates the bouncing of light across the scene. So if we take this and we just render it, you notice how, wow, that's like really bright. But look at how it's reflecting that. It's totally reflecting what's in the sphere. But we can change this a little bit. First thing we want to do is obviously we want to bring down the amount quite a bit. So let's bring it down to maybe somewhere under 20. I think let's try 15 here. See how that works. That's not too bad. Okay, that's looking pretty good. So now we've got the sphere kind of reflected here. But if you realize it's actually not a totally realistic reflection because, especially with something like granite, light doesn't really reflect all that well off of granite. And also light loses energy as it reflects. So as you get deeper into the reflection, you want this to kind of start fading out. You don't want it to be a perfect reflection like this. It's not a mirror. So how we do that is we go back into our ray trace map and we do what's called attenuation. So what we want to do is attenuate the reflection. So here we have what's called a fall-off type. Now we can do linear, inverse square, which is actually the way light does work, exponential, or what's called a custom fall-off, which is, again, a graph. Personally, I find that linear works fairly well for a lot of situations because it's really a fairly short fall-off. There you go. You see, it's pretty much what you want. Or if you want, you could do inverse square and give it a range. So let's say I want it to end after maybe 20 or so. How much would that be? So that's actually fairly short. If I want, I can increase it. And in fact, by tweaking this is probably a good place where you'd want to use active shade. So you say, well, 45 is too much. Let's bring it down to 33, and then it'll go ahead and update for us. There we go. So again, inverse square or linear are pretty good ways to do it. So that's another way of creating reflections. Now, the reflections created by ray trace are very accurate. So a lot of times that's the type of reflections you want to use. But it also takes a lot more rendering time when you get a lot of reflections, a lot of ray tracing going on in the scene. So a lot of times environment maps will do just fine. And if you can get away with them, then you're saving yourself a lot of rendering time. So that's the basics of reflections within 3ds Max. Now, you can do a lot of other things with reflections. For example, a lot of people add noise to the reflections to give you kind of more of a dusty surface, that sort of thing. But that's just standard mapping, and you're getting pretty familiar with that, so I'm sure you can figure a lot of that stuff out yourself. So let's go ahead and move on to the next lesson.